I'm going to hit the go live button, and then I'll say my opening remarks. Okay. Welcome, everybody. We are now live with Professor Paul Liptz. This is the third in our three-part series entitled Creating a Nation. We're talking about the most challenging, disruptive group or subgroup in all of Israel, the American Jews. So if that's what you're here to learn about, please stay with us. Today's program is being live streamed on Facebook. As I've urged people before the program, keep your clothing on and keep the clothing of your relatives on during this program. Thank you. Our program today is being sponsored by the Community Scholar Program. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary. And as I'll mention a little further, when you see our promo spot, we are now raising funds. It's our annual fundraising drive. If you like what we do and like what we've done for CSP, please support us. There are many levels you can choose from and many benefits at each level. Our program today and our series is being co-sponsored by Temple Beth Shalom of Needham. So if you're from Boston, from Needham, welcome. I hear you have nice weather, so maybe you're outside today watching us. Enjoy the weather. If you have friends in Boston or anywhere, share this program, share CSP with them. We love that our audience is growing nationally and internationally. We are dedicating this series in honor of Mike Lefkowitz, who many of you know from our community. He fell had a serious head injury, and I understand is recovering, but I will share more information when I have it. And we would like to thank the Jewish Community Foundation of Orange County for helping to underwrite our programs, or this particular series. Upcoming programs I wanted to mention, May 19th, 2020, so that's 2 days from now. Yiska Smith will be with us from Israel, live from Israel. The title of her program, Jewish Living as the Cultivation of a Spiritual Practice. If you've never heard of Yiska Smith, just Google Yiska Smith and you'll see why we have a really, not only is Yiska a great teacher, but Yiska has a very interesting backstory. Toby Khan, who will be, and was supposed to be, but will be, our first ever community 1 month artist in residence, will be doing a standalone program for us entitled Jewish Artists in Post-War Art on May 20th. Avi Strasberg returns for part 5 in our 5-part series, Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition, Good Sex and Bad Sex. And then, sadly, we will be done with Paul Lipptz's series. However, the good news is Paul will be back for Creating a Nation Part 2, another 3-part series. I can see and I can hear people clapping, even though they're muted, Paul. That's starting July 5th. So we'll be having other Sunday programs that you'll find out in the interim. We're going to give Paul a little break. But July 5th is the new series on this topic we're exploring today. Paul will be exploring 3 new communities in Israel, French Jews, Latin American Jews, and Jews from India. Those are other communities in Israel. So stay tuned for that. So while I have your attention, please enjoy the following promotional announcement. Hold on, let's see if this works.
Hi, I'm Michael Epstein, and I'd like to congratulate CSP on its 20th anniversary. Yasher Koach Ari, and to all of you out there who have contributed your time, your efforts, and of course, your financial support to this amazing venture. I've spoken at venues all over the world, and now from my little home office. And I can say, of CSP, there's no place like home.
Were you all able to see that? Yes? Okay, awesome. So how are we going to do this? If you're new to our programming on this particular program, if you have questions as we go along, just drop them in the chat and we will keep track of it. With regards to Q&A, we will then have a Q&A at the end. It's about a 45-minute program. And a few words about Paul Liptz. Paul is a social historian and CSP's recent 19th annual 1-month scholar in residence. He was on the Tel Aviv University faculty for 40 years, teaching graduate and undergraduate students in the Department of Middle East and African History and the International School, where he dealt with a wide range of topics. His main interests are history of the Yishuv, which is pre-state Israel, the modern state of Israel, and Arab women and nationalism in the Middle East. So with that, Paul, are we ready?
We're ready.
Screen? One thing, we did a test before we started, and Paul was having some issues with the shared screen. So when I put it on the shared screen, just if you see any weird stuff on your screen, like it's not clear, just chat to me. Otherwise, we'll assume it's more on Paul's side than on our side. So I'm going to share the program right now so we can get started. Hold on for a second, Paul. Oops. Okay, Paul, can you see it?
Going. So something general about research. The American group that came here arrived in 1945, and they're still coming in. So when you're a researcher, if you have to analyze a group like that, it's quite difficult. Excuse me. So what research is really like is to study a topic which is very well defined. So for example, the other groups that I've spoken about, or in January or now, the Yemenites, they essentially came to Israel over 1 year period. So it's very doable. You know who they are. They went to 1 or 2 regions. Same with the Iraqis. They came 1951 essentially. The Moroccans came over 5 or 6 years. So if people like researching those groups, there's something about researchers which is very interesting. They're happy when they study unhappy people. So the Americans aren't such a good case study, because Americans came because they wanted to come, unlike the Yemenites, the Iraqis, or the Moroccans. They came because things were bad for them. Some of them left. But the Americans came, in most cases, not because things were so bad. There were cases, but by and large, it's an open migratory policy. And the difference between the Americans and the other groups that I've been speaking about, Americans can always go home. Now, if we look at immigrant groups to Israel, generally, a significant number can't go home or really don't want to go home. Even take something like people from my part of the world. I come from Rhodesia. I'm not going back to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's among the 5 worst countries in the world. My wife comes from South Africa. She's unlikely to want to go back to South Africa. So the Americans are a different group and quite hard to study. As a result of that, by the way, there's not all that much material on Americans. You would imagine a large congregation, a large community like that, they would be a lot of research, but the truth is there's not all that much research, and a lot of the research is very, very detailed. They would take 20, 30, 40 people and interview them. So they micro studies. Not quantitative, they qualitative studies. So the available material, because I'm telling you this now, because you're going to see in my presentation, I'm trying to take the big picture and make sense of it. Often having to use a very significant number of different projects, research projects, to try and give us the big picture. So that's just a word about the material. So let's start. On the second slide, Ari, by the way, is the man in charge. The real contact of American Jewry with Israel starts in 1945. There were a small number who came earlier, one of whom we all know, Golda Meir. She came in the 20s, but she was an odd bod. Many people didn't even know what an American was all about. They'd seen American tourists. They hadn't thought that any American would really want to come and live here. And by the way, that was a stereotype which Israelis had for quite a long period of time. Come after the Second World War, America changed as a society, as you people well know. Suddenly Americans had traveled. Many Americans had been soldiers in Europe and Asia and the Far East. And suddenly they had a good sense of the world. And if you were Jewish, but not only Jewish, by the way, you would certainly have learned something about what had happened to the Jewish population. 6 million people, more or less, massacred in Europe. And so the Jewish story was interesting. As a result of that, in 1945, a call was put out by the Jewish Agency saying to people who had had some kind of military experience or some kind of contact with activities in the Second World War, which means America, which had been very local, a very local kind of society, suddenly becomes much more of an international country. And therefore, there are people, Americans, who had been involved in the Second World War. And in the early stages, the talents which were most required were talents on the sea. From 1945 onwards, the British had very strict restrictions. Every year, they would allocate a certain amount of certificates. The Israeli Jewish authorities could decide who would get those certificates, which in itself turned out to be very, very controversial, because firstly, Holocaust survivors were given preference, and secondly, there was always a political component. If you were within the mainstream Mapai Labour Party group, you'd been a member of one of the socialist youth movements, the chances are that you'd have a better chance of getting a certificate, as distinct from someone who was not a Holocaust survivor. And this, by the way, worked very much against North African Jews. And also, if you'd been in the opposition, in the Beitar youth movement or part of the Irgun. So there were tensions which were going on, but American Jews came, and very early on, we have 250 Jewish American crew members. Just a small comment about who they were. It's very funny. There's some interesting research where the Israelis, members of the Palmach and the Haganah, had experienced a tough life already. Some of them were themselves Holocaust survivors who had managed to get out and had quickly joined one of the Jewish militias. They thought the Americans were really very, very childish. The Americans seemed to enjoy life. And for quite a long time in Israel, enjoying life wasn't such a good idea. And so we have some interesting reports on the tensions between these young Americans who had been involved in the Second World War and were out for a bit more fun. And I don't say this in a negative sense. They were excited about it, whereas the Israelis who were involved were kind of serious and deep and took things very, very as very tough kind of situations. But somehow or other, they worked out with each other. And there's been some wonderful research telling how people of different cultural backgrounds slowly but surely respect each other. And that's what happened. 65 boats left Europe between 1945 to 1948. It brought 70,000 illegals. That's an amazing amount. Remember, all the time, whenever they were coming, there was a question of whether the British would allow them to come here or not. When they were caught, they were sent to Cyprus. That was the main detainment center. Cyprus was a British colony. Or if they got very, very close to Israel, Palestine at that time, they'd be taken to Atlit, a camp on not too far from Haifa. The picture you see is the Exodus. The Exodus had the largest number of people on the boat. It was quite a tragic story. They got to Israel. They were then taken off the Exodus and sent back to Germany. And that was a very tough situation. The next slide carries on the story, which tells us, by the way, because I'm in Israel, you'll be seeing pictures a little bit quicker than me. There was an organization called Land and Labor for Palestine. That was an American organization. They didn't want to say for one moment that there would be any military activity. So they came out with this a nice title. What we know about it in the rest of the world and afterwards in America is the title Machal, Mitnadvim, volunteers for the state of Israel. They were people who volunteered, by the way, taking tremendous risks coming here. Many countries in the world were totally against the idea that people would be coming to help Palestine. Remember, Palestine wasn't yet a country. So it seemed to be an illegitimate action in many cases coming here. And the American State Department was very strict at that time. American State Department, by the way, was not very friendly to Israel up until the late 60s. So certainly in the period we're talking about, the restrictions are very, very important. At this stage, we have a total of 1,100 people from the United States and 232 coming from Canada. The best known of all the Americans was Colonel David Mickey Marcus, an amazing character. And if any of you have seen the movie, it's quite hard to get hold of now. The 1966 To Cast a Giant Shadow, very, very Hollywoody, by the way. But if one can put some of the Hollywood sides aside, there's some lovely love scenes and people are singing and dancing and everyone looks very happy. And there's some amazing American actors there, Yul Brynner and people like that. There are 4 or 5 big American actors who are in the movie. But the important thing about the movie is it's a story which has, as one of the themes, Mickey Marcus. He was an aloof. He became a major general. He had had experience. Ben Gurion looked around and said, none of the people that we've got really can fight in an army. Excuse me. There had been militias before that. Not an army fighting all the Arab countries around us. So David Ben Gurion was very happy to take Mickey Marcus in. Unfortunately, he didn't know any Hebrew, and that becomes an important issue a little later. He really trained the Israeli army, an amazing contribution by a man who actually didn't initially want to come. The movie says, and it's correct, that Mickey Marcus wanted to stay at home. He'd been through the war in Europe. He had had enough of it. His family certainly didn't want him to leave home again, but he did come here to what would be Israel because he felt that this was important for him and for the Jewish people. The tragedy of Mickey Marcus is that late in the war in June 1948, he had been here earlier, but he didn't know Hebrew. And he was near Jerusalem, about 20 minutes out of Jerusalem, where a guard on night duty asked him for the code in Hebrew, Sisma, which every soldier knows, because if someone in the dark speaks to you, you have to tell them the code, and then you're okay, you're on their side. He didn't quite understand, he didn't quite catch it, and by mistake, he was shot. Tragic story, but that's what happened. After the Israel's War of Independence, the first people who came, next slide, please. The first people who came were young people. There had already been a problem which had developed in terms of the American-Israeli relationship, and it was the following. Jacob Blaustein, probably one of the 5 top Americans at that time, saw Israel as a refugee camp. This was for Jewish refugees who were running away from the events in Europe. Remember that a large number of people at the end of the Israel's War of Independence had found themselves in displaced persons camps. In fact, the number reached 250,000 after a short time, and these people had nowhere to go. So this country really did seem to be a country of refugees. Jacob Blaustein said, and one understands it, America is our home. Things were fine in America. It's true there had been certain components of anti-Semitism, and going back 20 or 30 years, there had been the Ford family, and there had been some anti-Semitism there. There had been anti-Semitic activities during the Second World War, but nothing that seemed to be a threat. So to be in America, and I did understand it in the 1940s and 50s, why would one ever want to go anywhere else? America was definitely the best country. It hadn't been harmed directly in the Second World War. David Ben Gurion looked at things very differently. David Ben Gurion thought that Western immigrants, Western OLIM, would be the people who would come. Now, why did he think that? And why, and we discussed it in my earlier sessions, why weren't the Ashkenazi elite so interested in people coming from North Africa? It was a supply and demand situation. The country needed Westerners. The country needed people who would assist Israel to deal with the Western world. Israel wanted to be a Western country. By the way, that wasn't true initially, because initially Israel saw itself as a member of the Third World. but we were rejected from the Third World group. You had the Eastern Bloc, the Third World Bloc, and the Western Bloc. Israel was rejected from the Third World group because they had become anti-Israel, and therefore Israel had no place to be but try and be part of the Western Bloc. David Ben-Gurion understood this, and he turns around to Blaustein and he said, look, we've built this country with your help, by the way, with tremendous American help, including some $90 million that Golda Meir picked up. We've done this together. It's our home. Why aren't you coming? And there, in the early period, essentially until the 1960s, we have a very small number of Americans coming to visit. And by the way, not all that many Americans coming to spend anything more than a few months. So you don't have OLIM, and even the visiting number was not all that impressive, at least until the 1960s. The next slide, please. So who were the early American OLIM, early American immigrants? Up to 1968, there were only 7,700. Well, for the largest Jewish community in the world, this is a very, very small number. But what happened was that some of them actually stayed, but it was very difficult. I've studied stereotypes all my life, and I'm amazed by them because I've always said the problem of stereotype is that you can't get rid of it. It's a little bit like COVID-19, unfortunately. Once it's there, you don't know how it's going to go away. And the stereotype of Americans was that they were wealthy. By the way, even when I arrived in Israel in 1967, if someone would ask me, where am I from? They thought initially, by the way, many Israelis, that anyone who spoke English was American. So when I said I wasn't an American, so they said, you're okay then. What does it mean? Well, those wealthy Americans, they're going to leave. Whenever anything gets tough, they're going to leave. By the way, it's not true, but it is a stereotype. The problem for the Americans was the being accepted. Americans didn't know Hebrew. By the way, there were immigrants from other countries of the world who did. Later on, when I do my session on Latin Americans learn Hebrew at Jewish day schools. They come to Israel with a high level of Hebrew knowledge. Many North African Jews know Hebrew, albeit with a different accent, kind of a guttural accent. Americans, by and large, came without Hebrew, hadn't had a great experience of the Middle East, and this really brought about this unfortunate and unacceptable stereotype. Americans were helped here by the AACI, a wonderful, wonderful, essentially voluntary organization, the Association of Americans and Canadians in Israel, who did unbelievable things in trying to help Americans who came here, it's true until today, to settle down. People who come from a different cultural background need intermediaries. The AACI is an intermediary organization helping new immigrants. I've done some seminars with them. The volunteers of the AAC are just remarkable. And they really, slowly but surely, started to change some of the earlier stereotypes. Next slide, please. Who stayed? Well, there's some sort of research. We don't have too many numbers here, by the way, so I just have to give the information in a fairly general way. And in terms of numbers, I want to make a comment now, which I think is very important. Of the groups that have come to Israel as immigrants, they have the highest percentage of those who leave. If you look at all the other immigrant groups, relative to the American figure, a pretty high percentage stay. Not all, and I'm the first to understand why people come and why they leave. But the proportion of Americans who leave was always higher. So quite early on, it was interesting to the researchers, and Professor Waxman was one of them, to find out who stayed, what really would keep you in the 1950s when America was a whole lot more appealing than Israel. Israel was a very much an undeveloped country. having experienced the war of a year and a quarter, November 47 to January 49, having experienced the Sinai campaign of 1956, and a lot of tension on the borders. So who stayed in a country with a poor economy with security problems? Well, we find, and we see it true for about 20 or 30 years, the unbelievable importance of informal education. Learning about the Jewish people in Israel, not in the schools so much, but rather in all those kind of organizations like Young Judea or NIFTY or any of the other organizations, many of them, B'nai Akiva, Beitar, B'nai Brit, all your youth movement, youth group organizations, they acted as a very important learning stage for those who came and those who stayed. There were those who just had a distinct ideological perspective, and if you were a young ideological person, that would help you particularly in the early years. There were a certain number of family members, and we know that chain migration to family members is very important. People want family by definition. And if some people had left in 1948 and stayed in Israel, quite often those who came and stayed would be people who already had members who were here. Religion becomes to be more important. The analysis we have of religion is very significant. Until 1967, it wasn't the dominating factor, but it was there. Somehow, if you had had a good biblical education, you were coming to the Holy Land. It wasn't just another country. It was a country that somehow or other you'd grown up with. You soon found out that there was no real connection between Tanakh and the reality of Israel. You would wander through the desert and think you're doing a simulation game with Moshe, but it was a very, very different reality, but it's a connection. And that's why religion definitely was important. And certainly from the end of the Second World War, as more information came out, from 1945, meeting with the displaced people, up to the Eichmann trial of the early 1960s, there was a much better sense of what had gone on in Europe. And certainly there were elements of disillusionment with America, which you people know better than I, comes and goes as time goes by. Sometimes it's anti-Semitism, sometimes it's economic issues, or those other realms which are problematic. I've put in that little, I've put in that little booklet there that it's absolutely delightful. Letters from Jerusalem, 1947 to 48. Tzipi Porat was a student at the Hebrew University, and she got involved, and she didn't even know how and why, with the Haganah. If any of you want to just look at a very cute YouTube, it sounds like Booba, the I thou. The YouTube, look at, you can find it under Tzipi Porat, about an 8-minute YouTube, where she explains exactly why she came and why she stayed. And she was one of the people who really felt that this was a country where she wanted to belong. She wanted to do something for it. I've met Tzipi on a number of occasions, and in her 90s, she's as remarkable as she was many years ago when I first met her. Over to the next slide, please. Up till the 1967 war, more or less, not too many people had come. So let's try and get a sense of the major change in the immigrant relationship of Americans and the state of Israel. The 6-Day War was unbelievable. It doesn't matter which community I look at, you see the power of the 6-Day War. It really was an amazing event. And what happened in the 6-Day War, the importance of the impact was almost as much what happened before the war as the war itself. Well, we know the war was 6 days, and that was quick. But the 3 weeks before the 6-Day War had an unbelievable effect on people. It seemed, and by this time, Holocaust awareness is very, very high. It really seemed that Israel, the Jewish people, were once again going to find themselves in a Holocaust kind of environment. If you look at the speeches of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, he made 3 very important speeches. And if you listen to those speeches, and at that time, the Arab world was powerful and large, and Egypt in particular was an awesome enemy, you would certainly believe that this was the state of Israel. The 3 weeks was pivotal in trying to change and in succeeding in changing the Israeli diaspora and Israel Jewish homeland relationship. In the Six-Day War itself, American volunteers were forbidden to come. That the State Department was very restrictive, and the 5,000 American volunteers who arrived actually came after the Six-Day War. Quite soon afterwards, by the way, already a week after the Six-Day War, one would meet these young volunteers. I, at that time, was on kibbutz Daphne in the north of the country. There were fortunes of young volunteers. By the way, they didn't know what to do with us after the Six-Day War. They thought it was going to be a long war. So afterwards, most of the kibbutzim were kind of quite happy if we went somewhere else because they just didn't need all of us. But the figures went up, 67, 660. It goes up to 930, 1969. Why 1969 and now not 68? It takes quite a long time to reestablish norms. And therefore, people would have wondered, some people have actually asked me the question, why didn't they come and stay just after the war? Because you have to change the understanding. You have to really make the message clear that it is possible to live in Israel after the Six-Day War. It's not America. It could never be America, but it is a place where you can actually live. And that's really a very important factor. The other factor which we see is very much is the role of the territories. Religious Jews, and anyone who studies Tanakh, we know where the biblical homeland is. It's a strange twist of history that the biblical homeland was under the Arabs, under the Palestinians, and the homeland that the Jewish people had was Sin City homeland, the coastal area. That has no biblical connection. So quite quickly after the Six-Day War in Israel, religious people who had really didn't seem to have too much of a political perspective on life suddenly become very political. And their political perspective is really religious oriented. It's the meeting of politics and religion. And that, as we find with Kfar Etzion, kibbutz Kfar Etzion, by the way, where there had been a Jewish settlement up to the 1920s. And then the whole area of the Etzion block had been harmed. And by 1948, there were no Jews living there. A very tough story. So initially, the idea was, let's go back to the places where we had been. From 1920s onwards, there was these little bits of land which had been bought. So the religious settlement movement starts going back to areas where their land was. As we see, 1974, you have a group called Garin Yamit. Garin Yamit was in Sinai. And in the 1973 agreement or war, there were already clear indications that there was going to be some sort of withdrawal. It wasn't clear exactly where and why, but a few years later, and certainly by 1979, there's been an agreement between Israel and Egypt that the whole of Sinai will be cleared of Jews, no more Israelis. So the Garin Yamit, who had, once again, my apologies, Garin Yamit, which they were forced out. It was a very tough event. They had some issues involved. And the other was a charismatic American Orthodox leader from New York, Rabbi Riskin. He had been unbelievably successful in New York. He had built a massive empire of a synagogue, but he had become very interested in Israel, and he arrives in 1983. By the way, he was initially miserable after having had this kind of massive congregation in New York, he thought he'd come here and be welcomed. Well, the Israeli rabbinate wasn't interested in him. There was not a great deal of love lost between even the Orthodox rabbinate in America and the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel. Some tensions continue until today. And so Riskin eventually settles down and builds for himself in what, as we see in the picture there, Efrat, Little America. When you go to Efrat, some of you may have been there, it seems almost like Ra'anana within the Green Line. A lot of Americans there. It seems very American. I mean, one of the amazing things about the settlements, we hear that word all the time, is that when you go to them, you don't think you're anywhere but mainstream Israel. It's all totally Israel. And one of the dreams of Israelis for a long time was to have a little house with a red roof, red sloping roof. That became a status symbol, quite amazing, because, snow doesn't really, limited snow doesn't require those kind of roofs. But that became the status symbol. And Efrat and some of the other places all have these very American kind of feel about it. 30% of Efrat are Anglo-Saxons, and the majority of that 30% are Americans. This is an unofficial figure, which the mayor of Efrat gave to a group of us when we were there some years ago. On to the next slide. The realities. 60s and 70s, when we read the sociological literature, there's some good research, by the way, micro research, not macro. They would take a small number of people and ask a bunch of questions. A number of things became very, very harsh for immigrants, all immigrants, and particularly for Americans. Just to quickly go through some of the terms, protectia means you have to know people in important positions. Important positions could be someone in the phone company. When we were here, we didn't get a phone for 3 years, and you could hardly get a phone here. I mean, the late 60s and 70s, a phone, there were no cell phones, but a phone was kind of worth, for an Israeli, the equivalent to a Rolls Royce. How do you get it? You'd have to know someone who knows someone who would help you to get a phone. I mean, it was crazy. You could die. Honestly, you could. Then you had to have what is called sechel, intelligence. Intelligence doesn't mean going to Harvard. Intelligence means shrewd. That's the Israeli concept of sechel. You have to understand where you are in Israel. You have to be shrewd in the Israeli sense. And how do you ever know something like that when you've gone to a nice Jewish day school in Orange County? How would you ever learn? Patience, savlanut, whenever anything didn't get done, and the bureaucracy was horrendous. So it's better now, but in those days it was terrible. All they would say is patience, and you were supposed to be patient. But if you're someone from the Western world, you think there's certain things you can do. I must just tell you a little story. A friend of mine was an elderly, he was a lot older than me. He went to America as a shliach, as an emissary in the early 50s. And he had experienced the reality of Israel. And so he got to in the United States, and he said, well, one of the things I have to do is I have to try and get a telephone. And he thought it would take a number of months. I mean, that's what you got used to in Israel. So he picks up the telephone to someone else's phone. He gets through to the phone company, and he says to them, I want to order a phone. And the person on the other side said, I'm very sorry, sir, but it'll take some time. So our friend says to them, well, you don't have to worry. I come from Israel. So that didn't mean anything to the person from the phone company. They said it'll take a bit of time. And I think it might take as much as 2 or 3 days. Well, this friend of mine told that story for years and years and years. He just couldn't get over this idea that you can get a phone in 2 or 3 days. And the person on the other side would be apologizing. By the way, the word slicha, my apologies, only came into Israeli society about 10 years ago. Please and thank you, B'vakasha v'toda, came in about 15 years ago. So it was a different kind of language. Hard to adapt in schools, army service, very, very tough, very, very tough. But what happened with Americans, by the way, it's an amazing American story, is the Lone Soldier Program. You see all those young Americans, they come here by themselves. I've always been amazed at it. Leaving, what they've grown up with, come to America. It's not easy. The American experience is very different from the Israeli experience. But as time went by, Americans learned what the Israeli army was about, very different from the American army. Women, by the way, we know from the surveys, had a lot of problem with male chauvinism here. By the way, the Hebrew language in the male is awkward for people who are used to non-gender language. But also there was a tremendous Israeli chauvinism. You have nice, kind of very condescending words that you would say to women, which weren't appreciated. And in the early stages, no longer today, you have the phenomenon of people from North African backgrounds marrying American women at quite a high percentage for many different reasons. Over to the next slide, please. Immigrants and increasing religiosity. We'll now speak about the modern time. I mentioned earlier religion becoming very, very important. Today, the average Israeli would almost expect the American coming here to live, not as a tourist or on a short-term program, to be either modern Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, to use the Israeli terms. Many of those who came for religious reasons, I mentioned the pull factor, the biblical land concept, the Holy Land concept, but many of the Americans came also because they found the Jewish, Judaic environment of America somewhat restricted. The minority group environment is somewhat problematic, kosher food and things like that. Christmas, known throughout the world what are you going to do with Christmas? Well, you can use something very serious about Hanukkah, but it doesn't resonate as well. By the way, America is the only country that I've ever been to at the end of the year, which shows a deep respect for Hanukkah. I'm always amazed going into American hotel, for example, and seeing a Hanukkah there together with the Christmas candles. They did love the cultural components of Israel and certainly the community identity. The two synagogues we've got there are, the top one is Yedidia in Jerusalem. It's very, very much an American Orthodox synagogue. I mean, it's interesting. The people there have made a policy decision. As soon as you come into the synagogue, to the shul, you speak Hebrew, because they don't feel comfortable in what I've just said, saying it's an American synagogue. But the truth is, we used to live in Jerusalem. When I went there, you would feel it very, very much as an American environment. And the lower one is the large synagogue in Ra'anana. So right through the country, you can't deny it, Americans, by definition, often want to go to a synagogue where even if the total language is Hebrew, it's somehow being within the Landsmannschaft, that concept that you feel comfortable with people from your own background. We know this from contacts with Eastern Europe, and it's just exactly true with contacts from Western Europe. On to the next, please. So why leave Israel? Well, all the human things, all the research says exactly what we see here. They want to be with a family. If you haven't got a family here or just one or two members, it's much nicer being in a family. The youth camps, by the way, people used to think the Israeli youth camps were the best, but they, to be honest, and I say this from experience, don't compare with the wonderful, wonderful summer camps, which unfortunately won't be around this year in the United States. For some of them, the religion which they found here, if they weren't in a synagogue, which was kind of Western, they didn't feel comfortable in the regular shul. And I always say that if someone came from Temple Emmanuel in New York, which is the picture you see there, which I remember sitting there when it was empty, feeling pretty much like, where am I? I mean, I'd never seen something like that before. But if this is where you'd grown up, well, you know, the Israeli synagogues for a long time didn't quite have the same feeling. Then there were the regular issues of daily living, very expensive. Israel remains an expensive country, hard to get the same kind of jobs. Housing is fortune, it really costs a fortune. And then the Israeli personality and language was enough in many years to send up to 30 or even 35% of the immigrants home. They might not have left immediately. 2 or 3 years later, they go home. The money they came with has all disappeared. They haven't been able to get the job they wanted, but we'll see that changes with time. And housing is absolutely impossible. I won't compare it with some parts in Orange County, but you know what I mean. The quick look at the non-Orthodox groups. Conservative movement, conservative MASORT movement. Up on the left-hand side, we got the lovely conservative Bet Knesset on French Hill. Over on the other side, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, you have Kibbutz K'tura. Kibbutz K'tura isn't defined totally as Masorti, conservative, but the youth movement there identifies with the conservative movement. At the bottom, you have the, just let me check, sorry, I'm just to give the correct information. At the bottom, we have, that's right, the Jerusalem Center for Conservative Judaism. Amazing, amazing project. They've renovated in the last few years. It's really a successful center. And at the bottom, we find the Arava project. It's one of the very unusual projects in Israel, taking people from all around the world, and particularly, by the way, Palestinians and Jordanians. And this is an ecological kind of environment, which has been very, very successful. And that's under the Masorti, overall Masorti umbrella. On to the next, please. Other conservative Masorti events are the women's movement generally. A lot of excellent seminars carried out in Jerusalem and other places. There's down at the bottom, you see the Tali School. The conservative movement started the Tali school system, an excellent school system which combines modern Western ideas with Judaism. It's a successful program. The Abodaya, those Africans you see there, the conservative movement went out to Uganda to convert or to make sure that the Abodaya would be perceived in Israel as being Jewish. They brought a rabbi of theirs to study in Israel, and they've had a lot of trouble with the Israeli rabbinate, very unfortunately. And at the bottom, you see the conservative yeshiva and rabbinic program. One side, there's one building which does the, on the other side of town, it's the yeshiva, and then you also have the American rabbinic program. They come to Israel for a year or two. On to the next one, we look at the reform movement. We see at the top Beit Daniel, Tel Aviv, does a lot of bar mitzvah stuff. Israelis are interested in the Masorti and reform movements, by the way. They don't necessarily want to change and become full members, but it's they feel good about it, you know, for a passage of life events. We also see Kibbutz Lotan over there, an eco kibbutz, out in the desert, amazing group of people. I've actually taught some of them many, many years ago on a gap year program. We see on the bottom Kol HaNeshama in Jerusalem, And then we also see Hebrew Union College. And we've just got one more slide of the reform movement. And then I'll make a general comment of conservative reform. Here we see some of the social responsibility seminars that are going. In the middle, we have Women at the Wall. By the way, Women at the Wall is a combined Orthodox, conservative, reconstructionist, and reform women organization. Some people see it as just reform, but Anat Hoffman, reform person, is very central there. And then what we see on the side of the girls who are doing an activity with a talit, that's a Tali Beit Vagan. Most of the Tali schools are very closely connected to the MASORT movement. A few of them are connected to the reform movement. A comment about reform and conservative. Not many people of reform and conservative background are seen here. We'll see a statistic quite soon. But the structures and the involvement of the conservative and reform movement in Israel have been very, very impressive, sometimes up against a brick wall with the authorities. On to the next slide, please. Back to the territories. From 1970s, the number gets larger. There's a major project called Operation 1000. The Jaffe, the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, Gush Emonim, established this program, particularly with summer experiences. They brought families over to spend a summer in one of the settlements in the territories in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and they loved it. I mean, there was a kind of warmth which they would experience that was quite successful. And by 1987, 45,000 US citizens are beyond the green line of the 300,000. The figure now is a great deal larger. The Americans, therefore, are perceived in Israeli society as being a very important component of those who live over the green line. And part of that, from their perspective, is sacrifice for the country and the people. The town that you see there is Ariel. Once again, the model of the red roofs, lovely little houses, by the way, which to get something like that in mainstream Israel, in the cities in Israel, is exorbitant. The prices are lower in the territories. We're getting towards the end, and just a few more slides, please. Success of the religious has been no longer AACI, which is Israel-based, but NEFESH LeNefesh. 2006 figures, I quote it, it's many years ago, but I've had trouble getting correct figures. Of NEFESH to NEFESH, 60% were Orthodox, 20% conservative, and 4% reform. The figures went up as a result of the financial crisis 2007 and 2008. By the way, some of those people who came to Israel because low unemployment and financial incentives, 3 or 4 years later went back, and one can understand why. And by 1990, between 93 and 2013, there are approximately 30,000 North Americans. By the way, the full figure of Americans in the country today is estimated between 150 to 200,000. Quite a significant figure in Israeli terms. Obviously, in a percentage term of American Jewry, that's small. On to the next, please. The last decades. So NEFESH to NEFESH BeNefesh figures have gone up. As you see, I mentioned the figure 35, but there were some years, a very few years, by the way, the figure 60% is unusual, but it's kind of normally around a third of the people who come leave. Where do they like to live? You go to your landsman. You go to people who like you. So it's a community over the Green Line. It's Ra'anana, it's parts of Tel Aviv, it's Baka of Jerusalem, all the areas where pretty much, if one ever wanted to sort of meet Americans, you can locate the 6 or 7 areas in the country. And certainly the religious spiritual pool was important. For some, Tel Aviv was appealing. For others, Jerusalem, and the rest just went where they wanted to, unlike some of the very early immigrants who came here. To Next slide, please. To update, August last year, we had 250 immigrants. 41 of those people were lone soldiers. It's an amazing figure. The majority of them plan to settle in the territory. So more and more we're seeing all the figures are showing us that Americans are religious, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, a significant number going to the territories. January 2020, the belief is that because of anti-Semitism in the United States, Aliyah is expected to increase. We know if we have a figure of February 2020, 1 out of every 4 Americans in jobs, adults, are working in remote companies in the US. It's become very, very well known, by the way, that your salary in Israel won't be adequate. So you have to live a certain time in America. Some people go back for a week or two every few weeks, and others do everything by remote, which you can do nowadays with internet. On to the next. Contributions, very quickly, because time is running out. Religious diversity. These are the realms that Americans have given Israel. I've searched for ages, and I think my list is correct. Religious diversity, volunteering, sport, recycling, which started in Jerusalem with some young Americans, is now seen over the whole country. Well-educated, the best educated immigrant group, or among the best. Some people say the British is on the same line, but very much the case, and certainly polite. Stereotypes. I won't go into the details. You can look for yourself. None of those stereotypes are intended to be positive. By the way, I did some simulation games with American students and soldiers, Israeli soldiers, and it was amazing. On the very first session I had, I asked the Israelis to tell me what they think of Americans, and they used those terms, soft, gentle, and kind. And the American students were so happy. They thought, wow, these people love us. The Americans didn't think those were compliments. And it was an amazing kind of situation of trying to explain how people use the same words but think differently about it. These are the stereotypes. You can look for yourselves. If we go on to the next slide, please. Generalizations. The generalizations are, and this is based on as much information as I could get, overall well-educated and ideological, more than most other groups, very committed and concerned. Americans are seen as a totally committed group, not necessarily, by the way, going into politics. There are very few people going into politics, except Moshe Arens, who we see here, Minister of Defense in the past, who, by the way, from his right-wing perspective, was very, very sensitive to the Bedouin. The Bedouin Israel have had a rough time, and he, as a right-wing person, was quite exceptional from his political point of view in terms of caring for them. And one of the things which harms Americans for a long time is the brashness and arrogance. To the next one, just a little bit more of generalizations. We saw about the West Bank, grateful for Israeli healthcare and low university costs. A lot of them would say that. And we find increasing number of retirees coming here. By the way, there are two pictures. One are religious women in Bet Shemesh, where we have a lot of American modern Orthodox, and young Israeli Americans who are in the settlements, the hilltop groups, we call them. To the next one, please. These are the sources. Hillel Halkan, still writing, A City on a Hilltop. She's written a few articles. Sarah Hirschborn, A City on a Hilltop is an excellent book, by the way. Letters from Jerusalem by Tzipi, An American Aliyah by Chaim Waxman. Those are probably the 4 best books to read if you want to get an overview of what happened with American Aliyah. On to the next. And I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Always rushed. My clock goes too fast. But I always mean to give you more time, but there is time for questions. And you saw my email, so over to Ari. Please ask the questions. He'll be in charge of when we have to close shop, but also anything that you want to ask me by email.
Thank you. So while you guys are writing your questions, I'll say a few things, then I'll go through as many questions as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. First of all, I want to thank Professor Liptz for another great series. This was Creating a Nation Part 1. For those of you who joined us a little late, we are going to welcome Professor Liptz back in a few weeks for Creating a Nation Part 2. We'll focus on the French and Latin American and the community from India that are in Israel. In the next few weeks, our Sundays, we will have a series by Mark Michael Epstein, a CSP favorite. His topic will be Inside the Jewish Mind, 3-part series focusing on Jewish art. And then from the UK, Rafi Zaram will be joining us. So we have a lot going on. And I hope you will join us for those programs as well as the next series with Professor Liptz. With regards to Americans in Israel, a few questions for you from the chat list that I'm picking up here. Number one, how are the Reform kibbutzim doing these days? And are they mostly Americans on those kibbutzim or moshavim?
Okay. Look, it's a tough business. Down there in the Negev, there's kibbutz Lotan, but kibbutz Yahel. Kibbutz Yahel has been deprivatized, which is the norm of the kibbutzim. There are approximately 280 kibbutzim in the country. If I remember correctly, there are only about 15 which are still 100% kibbutzim. So kibbutz Yahel is doing okay. They're doing fine. Kibbutz Lotan is an old style kibbutz, totally egalitarian. They are doing okay, but it's hard. I think that would be a correct kind of evaluation. I think it's true of a lot of the kibbutzim in the Negev. It's not because they're reform or anything else. It's because that area still remains a tough area, underdeveloped.
You mentioned that many or some Mizrahim like to marry American women. Did I get that right? And someone asked, why is that the case?
Can I be non-politically correct, which I think is what I am quite often.
Well, you're Israeli, so you're allowed.
I'm going to try and say it nicely. American women would come and found these sort of dark, very male males appealing. These Israelis, particularly of dark skin, by the way, who were different from them, seemed so very different from American men. And that was appealing initially. It was somewhat exotic. And so that was kind of an important issue. By the way, unfortunately, exotic at the honeymoon stage doesn't always remain exotic 5 or 10 years later. And so, like many of these kind of relationships, it has some rough sides to it also. But it was very, very much recognized. I mean, I must admit, thinking of the Mizrahi men, American women, families that I know, I mean, some of them are quite happy marriages, but it's kind of unusual. It's exotic. That's the only word I can use. Exotic love.
My understanding with regard to the role that Americans have played in Israel is primarily in the maybe high-tech business area. And so you didn't put up names for the other subgroups. You showed names of people who've made it big in other areas of Israeli society, from music to government. You mentioned Moshe Aarons in government, but are there other people who are Americans who you can mention that, you know, make us all feel a little better, that have done something significant in Israel besides settle the West Bank?
I think the American, let's take a realm which is very interesting, sport. American contribution to sport is quite amazing. Americans came and they said, sport isn't just what you do, over the weekend. It's a serious business. So, people like Tal Brody and many others really had a tremendous influence. American doctors, in many hospitals, you have them. Americans in academia have done very well. So, by the way, unless you get into politics, you don't really have the image of that group being powerful. But politics is only one realm of society. So generally speaking, I would say Americans have been everywhere, high tech certainly, but in all the realms that require education, you can find them.
And just to make sure that I understood you correctly, but it is logical, the highest percentage of the Americans who moved to Israel are in the religious camp, correct? And the lowest percentage would be in the reform movement. And I don't know about the conservative movement, and that people who are not Orthodox who are moving tend to be people who are retiring to Israel. So is that a correct understanding of the situation there?
Yeah. By the way, the American religions, I rarely see, you see, we look at NEFESH, NEFESH. How do we know what's going on? We look at the NEFESH for NEFESH figures. Every time a plane arrives, we get a figure. So that's the way that we know that by and large, and that's the main program, best way to come to Israel today. It's properly organized.
Do Americans who live in Israel vote in the same numbers as other Israelis?
I think we're not quite sure because they're so diffuse. I would make an educated guess to say they vote at a higher percentage than the norm, which anyway is quite high. Israel has a high voting pattern. Educated people generally in Israel, I think it's true in other countries, tend to vote, and therefore that would be the American situation. By the way, in the territories in particular, the percentage of voting is extremely high because by and large they're smallish settlements and kind of everyone knows if you haven't voted. So there's some sort of subtle shaming process that goes on. But Americans are voters, but very few since 1949 have actually been involved in politics.
And given the Anglo background, do Americans hang out, interact more with other Anglos like South Africans and the English and the Australians?
Absolutely. Yeah, because, you have an area like Ranana or Baka or these kind of areas, absolutely. It's the nature of the beast. You socialize with people who are most similar. By the way, with immigrants, there's what we call the when we phenomenon. When we lived in our own country, everything was so good. So everyone does when we for the last 10 minutes, and then you say, why don't you leave? Because no, this is a better place to be, even with all our when we's. So that's the Anglo kind of way of dealing with it. But you really do naturally get to socialize with people most similar to yourself. It just seems to be nature of the beast.
Alita wants to know if you move from America or from another Anglo country, do you become Israeli in your personality, or do you retain that Americanness that you come with you? Your kids obviously would be different, but how about you? Seem to have retained your Zimbabweanness, but you
retain it. The first generation always remains being an Anglo. By the way, it's not true with all countries, with all groups. Argentinians managed to become Israeli much quicker. The Anglos, because of the language, by the way, English is a high priority language in this country. So you keep with your high priority. Spanish doesn't have the same status. So that's one of the reasons. So I'm still very, I always say of myself, I've been here 53 years. I feel solidly Israeli. I mean, this is what I know. But I meet a regular Israeli, a native-born Israeli. We know that we're different. By the way, we also know from our children. When our kids were young, they used to say to my wife and myself, it's really a pity that our parents are Anglos because we don't know how to shout and scream. So we say, we don't, what can we do? But it was very, very clear. The children very much picked up that their parents were different from others. In the end, 20 years later, they were very grateful. But it took some time to get them to realize that.
Why do you think Americans haven't been involved that much in Israeli politics, rising to high levels in the government?
Too dirty. It's filthy. Politics is tough. Israeli politics is ghastly. I mean, I just can't tell you how awful Israeli politics is. It's not only now, but it's always been like that. Americans just haven't got that kind of personality. It doesn't make sense to them. So they would therefore like to influence society in realms where they have the best talents. And I think it's by and large a good decision.
How are Americans viewed relative to Europeans, French, other Anglos in Israel from the perspective of how are Americans viewed by other Israelis, like compared to how they view Europeans or French or the UK?
Looked at very differently. Some of the generalizations that I mentioned are there. They were for a long time perceived as having money. That's now changed. There is the feeling that if things get really bad, they will leave, but that is going through change. So I think that's, in terms of how they looked at compared with the French, I think the big issue is Israelis today know that if you come from a country where the reality in your home country is tough, there's a chance that you'll stay here. If you come from a country where life is easy, when things get tough, obviously you've got another alternative. So I think that's what it is. By the way, the word yerida, someone who left the country, used to be a terrible expression. I don't think it has that feeling at the moment anymore. Things change.
And just to end question and answer on a personal note, tell us about your family, because you have kids and grandkids now. So kids, I assume, who were born in Israel, since you moved to Israel before you were married, and then grandkids. When you look at them, are they more like you and Anglo, or are they more Israeli in the sense that you discussed, the difference between the cultures and personalities?
Cultures. The grandparents want them to be like us, but the parents say, no, not a good idea. So what we've given them in many senses, firstly, language. We try, most of our grandkids are fluent in English, 2 or 3 still find it a bit difficult. We have a different behavior, and I think they appreciate it. I think there is the certain softness of coming from the Anglo background. As I mentioned, a bit of a joke. We do say please and thank you, and our kids make their children say please and thank you. I think there's a happy intermediary level that we've reached our family. We don't want them to be Anglos, but we want them to take some of the Western culture and incorporate it in their lives and their behavior. And I think that's what it's all about.
Not to get too personal, but did your kids marry other Anglos, or did they marry into other communities in Israel?
Okay, so we have 4 children, all of them are married. Child number 1 married a 3rd generation Israeli family, but very, very Western. Her father was a deputy mayor in Jerusalem. Our 2nd son married a 3rd generation Israeli family, but they originally come from Hungary. So there's that immigrant kind of sensitivity. Our daughter, the 3rd child, married someone of Iraqi mother and Russian father. And our 4th son married a good South African woman. So that's what happened with all of them. And they get on well together. It's kind of nice when they get together.
Well, it's nice as a sociologist to have a sociologist project in your own family that you can watch over the years. We wish you many years to watch your family grow and grow. So final announcements. Next Sunday, we start our 3-part series with Mark Michael Epstein. It's called In the Jewish Mind. His subtopic next Sunday is Jewish Monsters. And then the following Sunday, Emotions in Art. And finally, it's a CSP travel adventure, Jewish Tours of Heaven and Hell. I guess since we can't go to Israel, no one can travel right now. I don't know if you heard, we pushed off our Israel trip for 1 year to the following October. We'll have to do virtual travel. So we might as well start in heaven and hell. And then we'll go to some other more easily received, accessible locations. Yes, sorry.
Can I make the last comment?
Not yet. Hold on. Let me say...
the last comment.
Okay, I'll give you the last comment. Yiska Smith, who's teaching, I told you to look up Yiska Smith online. Just trust me. Look up Yiska Smith. You'll see why they're an interesting personality. Her class starts at 10 a.m., okay? So if you tune in on Tuesday, it's 10 a.m. Wednesday, Toby Kahn. Thursday, Avi Strasberg. Paul Liptz. Last comment.
I think, Ari, I'm speaking in everyone's name. We want to thank you. We really do. I mean, you know, when I met you in January, and people said, this guy, you can't believe him. I wasn't impressed before I'd met you. But you've done an amazing thing. In the advert, the fundraiser that you put forward, it's true. I've traveled the world. I've been to America 20 times, 25 times. I've never met anything like the educational program that goes on in Orange County. And it's an amazing project, and it's due to you. Now, before you people came on, Ari asked me if I was prepared to do a matching scheme for the fundraising. That if you give $1, I would give $1. I thought about it, and I will still have to think about it a bit more. But I think what you people are doing in Orange County is amazing. I really mean it. And as long as this program goes on, it's good for you. It's good for people like myself. And kol hakavod, Ari. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, all of you who are past donors and hopefully future donors. We are fundraising now. We anticipate our whole year of programs will be online. Our 1-month scholar, Ariel Berger, we're honoring tomorrow, Martin Brower will be online. And we have an adult retreat that'll be online. There'll be programs for members. There'll be programs for the community at large, but it really takes everybody to help make this happen. So I want to thank you all who have committed already to donate funds. Thank you to the Vogelfangers and the Haymans and the Gustons and the Binders and the Lehrers and Ash and Judy Fisher and Rita Rubin and the Rofskis and the Aronsons and Mark Michael Epstein, our first donor. Thank you all for supporting us in the past. And Martin and Tamar Brower, we look forward to celebrating you. And for a whole month in January, I will see you all this week in some fashion. Have a great Sunday. Get some sun, get some exercise. Thank you, Paul. We'll see you in a few weeks. Okay? Thank you, guys.